I am very excited for today's video because I'm going to be sharing 9 coloring techniques that I have been obsessed with lately and I think have completely transformed my pages since the beginning of my coloring journey, which next month it's going to be 2 years since I started that journey. How time flies. You have probably seen me use all of these techniques in past videos, but I wanted to put them all together into one super handy little resource so you can come back and watch this video whenever you're looking to try out some new techniques. Though before we jump in, I do have a little announcement / small favor to ask. If you've been watching my content for a while, you'll know that I've been tossing around the idea of starting a Patreon for a little bit, and I think I finally managed to free up some time to make it happen. Hopefully starting in October. However, I want to make sure it's a space you really want to be a part of with content you're excited about. So I've popped a short survey in the description box below so you can tell me exactly what you want to see. Whether that's full page color alongs, chatty color with me sessions, or dedicated tutorials. You can let me know all about it in that survey. And just so we're clear, nothing is going to be changing with my YouTube channel. I'm still going to keep the uploads exactly the same. This Patreon is for those who just want some extra content from me every month and want to support the channel a little bit more. So yes, if you're curious about a pictured purpose Patreon, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a minute to fill out the survey in the description box below. You can really tell I'm so awkward when it comes to self-promotion, can't you? Anyway, with that little announcement over and done with, let's get into the first coloring technique. And the first coloring technique is using washi tape to mask off a background border for your coloring pages. If you know me well, you'll know that I avoid coloring to the edges of my coloring pages at all costs. I don't know, I just find it super fiddly and kind of annoying. So creating an uncolored border around the edge of my pages has become my go-to. Now, I've tried a lot of different tapes and methods in the past. Ripping my pages seems to be my fatal flaw as a colorist, but this process I'm about to show you really keeps that risk at a minimum for me. First, I rule out and lightly sketch a border somewhere around the 1 to 2 centimeter mark. For this page, I did 1 centimeter. Then I grab my washi tape. I really have found that washi tape is a much better option over masking or low tack tape. I press it onto my shirt or pants to reduce the stickiness and apply it to the page, lining it up to the border that I just measured. If I want to be extra precise, I will run a ruler over the tape just to make sure it's evenly adhered. I'll share my method for removing the washi tape in just a second, but first we're going to move on to the next technique, which is a dappled neocolor 2 background. We all know by now that I am obsessed with my neocolor 2 backgrounds. I rave about them all the time. They're just so fun and creatively freeing to do. Plus they look super effective and are much quicker to create than doing a background with colored pencils. When I create this kind of background, I usually choose around 2 to 3 colors, and I start by lightly scribbling my first layer onto the page. I keep the pressure light because I want to build up the colors in layers. Neo colors can get pretty pigmented, so it is easier to add more color than it is to take it away. And this first layer really is just about me figuring out where I want my colors to go. I also like to keep the pigment towards the outer edges of the page and sort of fade it towards the center of the illustration. This creates a soft vignette effect that naturally draws the eye inward. For this particular page, I did tweak that approach a little by adding yellow in the center to match the clear light source we have from the lantern. If the light source wasn't there, I would have just naturally let the blue and green sort of fade out towards the middle. But even here, you can see that the dark edges to lighter center look is still prevalent, even though I've done some yellow in the center. One thing I've learned the hard way though is to let your page completely dry dry between layers in order to prevent bleed through to the opposite side. You can let it air dry if you're patient, but I am not a patient gal. So I use this heat tool here to dry my page between layers, but I'm pretty sure a hairdryer is just as effective. For the second layer, I add more of the lighter colors where the background still needs a little bit more pigment, and then introduce some slightly darker Neo 2 colors. Again, focusing on the outer edges, activate it with the water brush, and then let it dry fully again. For the third and final layer, I'll still use those same darker neocolor 2 shades, but this time I take the pigment directly from the pastel using a water brush and then apply it to the page using a stippling or bouncing kind of motion. This creates that dappled organic texture that makes my colorist heart very happy. And I actually ended up adding an even darker shade into the corners to really amp up that vignette drama. We know I love my drama. And obviously I let it completely dry one last time. And then because I can't resist adding a little extra creative chaos to my backgrounds, the next technique that I've been loving is acrylic marker paint splatters. You can totally do this with regular acrylic paints or watercolors, but I tend to reach for my markers because I have way more colors of those than I do in actual paint form. To start, I pump some of the paint onto a palette, and then I take a damp paintbrush and dilute the paint to be runny enough to splatter, but not so watered down that you lose the color's vibrancy. Once I've got that nice runny consistency, I load up my brush with as much paint as it can hold and hover it over the area I want to splatter. And tap the handle of that brush with another brush or something similar to fling the paint off. I'm not super precise about this. I don't mind if a few splatters end up within the illustration itself, but if you'd rather keep your main image clean, you can just cover it with a scrap piece of paper or a rag before you start tapping like I've done here. Now coming back to our washi tape border, I've got a few extra tips to help you avoid any page ripping disasters. First, make sure your page is completely dry if you used any wet media for your background. Then you can use a hairdryer or heating tool to gently warm up the washi tape. This helps loosen the adhesive and makes the tape much less likely to tear your paper. When it comes time to peel, you want to go very, very slowly. Some people swear by pulling the tape at a certain angle, but I think the most important thing is the pace that you go at. That said, be careful if you're using a heating tool like I did, because yeah, I got a little overzealous and actually burnt my paper slightly. That was a big oops on my part. I've seriously never done that before, but maybe it was supposed to happen in this video so you don't make the same mistake. Burnt page aside, this is my favorite type of background to make right now. I love the contrast between the clean, crisp border and the messier Neocolor 2 background. And in true Bob Ross fashion, I made that burnt section look intentional by adding some brown soft pastel splotches to the page, you know, happy little accidents, right? The fourth technique is one that I think has really contributed to the transformation of my coloring pages, and that is basing. My personal take on basing is simply applying a flat foundational layer of color to each element on my coloring page before adding any shading or details. I usually reach for one of two different mediums for my basing: watercolor pencils for my double-sided coloring books, or alcohol markers for my single-sided coloring books like Forest and Nature here. That's why I was very excited to have recently been sent Arrtx's new set of pastel alcohol markers. This set comes with 64 pastel shades plus a black and colorless blender. The markers are dual tipped with a brush on one side and a chisel on the other, and they come in this super cute reusable portable case. I'm absolutely loving the purple foiling on this packaging. I've lowered the brightness of the footage here to show the swatches as accurately as possible, but I will say some of the colors are very pale to the point where they barely show up on the swatch card. But besides those handful of colors, I'm really happy with the rest of the color range in this set, and they've definitely become my go-to for basing in my single-sided coloring books. There are so many reasons why I love basing my pages. First, it covers all of the white tooth of the paper, which means I don't have to work nearly as hard when I'm shading over the top with my colored pencils later on. Less hand pressure, faster shading, ticks all my boxes. It also allows me to create more interesting color combinations because I can layer different shades over top of the base layer without having to worry too much about muddy blends. And because there's already pigment down, the end result usually ends up looking more vibrant and saturated as well. And on top of all that, basing also is a great planning tool. It helps me map out my color palette and figure out where everything's gonna go before I commit to my pencil shading. And for pages like this one where there's a strong light source, it is a lifesaver because I can focus entirely on mapping out how the light will hit different areas without stressing about color combos or detailed shading just yet. I know some people like to do a little bit of basic shading within their base layer, but honestly 99% of the time I'm just doing some flat color on the page. Okay, so technique 5 is one that I've only recently started exploring and kind of wrapping my head around, and that is using a complementary color as your shadow shade in your color combos to make shadows appear richer and more natural. A quick color theory refresher: if you look at the color wheel, complementary colors sit opposite one another. For example, I wanted to color the leaves on this page using a green combo, and since red is opposite green on the wheel, I chose a dark maroon red as my shadow shade and then layered my green combination on the top. And then surely you'll see me use a dark blue as my shadow shade for some of the florals and mushroom caps because I wanted those to be an orange combo, and blue sits opposite orange on the wheel. I know it sounds a little confusing at first, but trust me, it gets easier the more you practice and get to know your complementary colors. If you are unsure, try testing your color combos on a scrap piece of paper first to make sure that the shadow shade you've chosen is the right tone and vibrancy. And don't forget, Google is your best friend if you're struggling to figure out the complement for a specific color. But yeah, a lot of you will know that I've fallen more and more in love with this technique recently, as it does add such depth to my color combos without reducing any of the vibrancy. I didn't actually have to do it for this page here, but sometimes even after using a complementary shadow, I might have to go over the top with a dark gray or black pencil to add even more depth. But yes, this is only a glaze at the end, not my initial shadow color. The next technique you've already seen me implementing as I've been coloring the leaves and florals, and that is avoiding coloring all the way to the edge of the line work when you're shading objects that you want to appear rounded or spherical. Instead, what you want to do is leave a thin gap of the paper showing, or in my case, the base layer showing, between the shading and the outline. This subtle highlight sort of tricks the eye into seeing a curved surface by mimicking the way light naturally catches along the edge of a rounded object in real life. It works particularly well for things like berries, bubbles, gemstones, flower centers, but honestly, I even use it on elements that aren't perfectly rounded as well, just because I love the extra dimension that it adds. It makes my finished pages look less flat and helps the objects sort of pop off against my often busy and maximalist backgrounds. This is another technique that can appear quite tricky at first, but yet again, the more you practice and get your head around it, eventually it kind of just clicks and becomes second nature. With all that being said though, sometimes I do find the gap of the white or base layer might look a little too pale or unfinished next to the darker shading. And that did happen on this page just because of the strong light source and shadows I had going on. So in situations like that, I'll go in with the second lightest color in my combo, not the lightest, and just color the gap in. It still maintains the spherical effect, just in a more subtle, harmonious way. The seventh technique is one that I picked up from my favorite colorist and coloring book artist, Rita Berman. I'm not sure if there's a formal name for it, but basically it involves adding little random tinges of color to the elements on your coloring pages. I especially implement this for elements like florals and greenery, but you can do it on whatever you like, just go for it. The only kind of rules I follow for this technique are pretty simple. I generally like to place these tinges of color closer to the shadowed areas rather than the highlights. And I also try to stick to analogous colors. Analogous colors are those that sit next to each other on the color wheel, and by using them rather than complementary colors, for example, you kind of mitigate the risk of any gross muddy blends. So for this page, you'll see that I added red tinges to the orange florals since red sits next to orange on the color wheel. And then for the greenery, I added tinges of blue because blue sits next to green. But alas, rules are meant to be broken. Sometimes I will use non-analogous colors for my little random tinges, especially if I'm experimenting or don't mind having a little bit of a muddy blend on the page that I'm working on. It can add fun, unexpected depth and interest to a page. The last two techniques I'm going to share with you in this video happen right at the end of the coloring process. It's those final details that really just finesse a page, in my opinion. And so the eighth technique is covering the line work with acrylic markers. Now, I don't just mean covering the line work wherever you like, which is something I definitely fell into the trap of doing when I first started trying this technique. The key is to cover the line work in areas where you want the highlights on the page to be more emphasized, or where your light source hits the surrounding elements, just like in this lantern illustration here. So since I created a yellow light source, I used a fine-tipped yellow acrylic marker to cover the line work wherever I've added yellow shading to the elements closest to the lantern. You may find that it takes a couple of layers to fully cover the line work and make sure none of the black is still peeking through underneath. Just make sure you allow each layer of acrylic marker to fully dry, otherwise you risk smudging or an uneven coverage. This technique really has come in handy for me over the last couple of months as I've been learning and experimenting with coloring and portraying light sources in my pages. It's definitely a learning process. Hopefully one day I'll be confident enough to give you a tutorial, but for now I find this to be a simple and effective way to suggest and emphasize a light source as a light source coloring newbie. And finally, the ninth technique I'm sharing in this video is one I absolutely cannot live without: acrylic marker dots, or in this case, gel pen dots. I recently added the 99 set of Languo gel pens to my coloring toolkit, and they've been an absolute godsend for creating super fine dot details in my pages. I do have some general coloring rules here as well when it comes to adding my acrylic marker or gel pen dots, but like most of my techniques, I don't stick to them strictly. So firstly, if there's any florals on the page, I like to add 2 to 3 colors of dots to the centers. I generally use at least 1 or 2 lighter colors and then 1 darker color. You will also notice that I like to focus these dots in the shadowed areas, and I also make sure to vary their sizes and spacing to keep things looking natural and a teensy bit dynamic. Once the florals are done, I then move on to any elements that are looking a little bit bland and could use some extra visual interest. On this particular page, it was the greenery that was looking a bit too heavy and meh for my liking, so I added some light green and darker teal dots, focusing them near the shadowed areas once again. And then finally, I love to add dots to my backgrounds. Luckily, Rayhan had already illustrated some dots in the background of this page, page, so I simply covered those with the same two colors I used for the greenery. Just helped everything feel a little bit more cohesive on the page. I'm sure some people will say I add too many dots to my pages, but I just love it. I adore the fantastical vibe that it creates, and it adds somewhat of a glittery, shimmery effect without having to deal with the mess of actual glitter. But there you have it, everyone. Those are the 9 coloring techniques that I am currently obsessed with and that I feel have transformed my coloring pages. I'm sure I'll keep discovering new techniques as time goes on, so maybe I'll have to film another one of these videos in 6 months' time to keep you updated on what's working for me. For now though, I hope this video has been helpful and has given you some little nuggets of coloring wisdom to try in your pages. As I said in the intro, I'll have my little Patreon survey in the description box below. I would really love your input if you're interested in becoming a member of a Pictured Purpose Patreon. And I'll also include product links to this pastel set of Arrtx alcohol markers in case you're looking for a great pastel set for basing your pages. Until next time, happy coloring friends. Have a good day, have a good life, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!